Welcome to Daily Dose of Aramaic. This is Lesson 10, in which we will be discussing adjectives. And more information on this topic can be found in Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters, pages 72 to 79. Now, what are adjectives? Adjectives are words that describe qualities or states of being of nouns. So we shouldn't be surprised that there's going to be similar grammatical information to take into account, similar to nouns, as we discuss adjectives. And that we're going to see that right here with the various suffixes that adjectives take as they match nouns, because we're going to expect agreement between adjectives and nouns that they have an association with in gender, number, and in some cases definiteness. And I'm showing that on the screen. So we see the masculine and feminine gender, and on the left is the paradigm of the endings, and on the right is Rav, that adjective, which happens to be the adjective in Biblical Aramaic that has the most of these endings attested in the text. Okay, so all of the endings are attested for various adjectives, but for Rav we have the most. So on the top is the singular version of the Rav adjective, and on the bottom is the plural, and both of them have a determined state form. And I should say right now that there's also the possibility of an adjective being in the construct state just as nouns are. There aren't many of them, and so to simplify the presentation, I thought I would just place the regular non-determined form as well as the determined form on the screen. So let's see this in action by taking out the paradigm and shifting to looking at Rav. So here we have in Daniel 5:1 a great feast, where the feast word looks a lot like Biblical Hebrew lechem, doesn't it? But it has a different meaning. It's feast. And it's a masculine singular noun. And so the adjective great that is modifying that noun also is masculine singular. So there's no special suffix attached to this masculine singular adjective, not in a construct, not in the determined state. Okay, so that's easy to see. Let's look now at a feminine dual noun and the adjective it takes. Now, adjectives in Biblical Aramaic, just like in Biblical Hebrew, don't have a dual form. So when duals are modified by adjectives, the adjective needs to be plural. And how do we know this is dual? Well, the teeth word or the tooth word is sheen noon. And then following sheen noon is the ayin ending. So that's a feminine dual there. Now, the adjective that follows, and it's actually several words later in Daniel 7:7 for great, is Rav Ravan. And we just want to say that other adjectives in Biblical Hebrew, they don't duplicate the adjective resh beit in this case and have another resh beit following it to give the plural. So this is just an interesting characteristic of this particular adjective. And we see it has the comets noon ending that's expected for feminine plural. Okay? And then lastly, let's look at an example of the determined feminine plural. So the first word in the singular would be mem lamed hey. So we know it's plural because we see that yod there, right? And then to put the aleph on the end, it's in the determined state. So the first word there that I display from Daniel 7:11 is the words. So to modify that noun, the adjective needs to be, well, it needs to match in gender first. It needs to be feminine, and it needs to match the determined state of the words. So literally, it's the words, the great. So we see the tav and hey ending that are required for a feminine plural adjective in the determined state. Okay. Now there are different uses, and the use that we've seen so far of adjectives is probably the first kind of use of adjectives that comes to mind. So we saw a great feast, great teeth, and the great words. So that makes a lot of sense to us, but there are actually three different uses of adjectives in Biblical Aramaic, just as in Biblical Hebrew. The next kind we're going to look at is the predicative use of adjectives. Now, what's that? Well, I'm going to show a couple examples here. Let's look on the right. The dream is certain. So, and certain is the dream. is how we could literalistically render those first two words in Daniel 2:45's phrase that I've reproduced here. Okay, so and the dream is certain. There's a conjunction in the front. So the first word is the adjective. What do we notice? Well, it's agreeing in gender and number with the dream, but there is no aleph there. It's not agreeing in determination. So one of the keys for knowing that we're dealing with a predicative use of an adjective is disagreement in definiteness. Okay, so the agreement was in the case of the attributive use of the adjective. The disagreement that's our key for knowing that it's a predicative use. And certain is the dream. And then looking to the left, ruling is God Most High. So God Most High here is a proper noun in this case. There's only one God Most High. Therefore, it's automatically definite. So there's a mismatch of definiteness, right? With this ruling characteristic in the adjective shalit, right? And with the proper noun God Most High. So we know that this is predicative. And what does that even mean, predicative adjective? It means that we're going to supply a to be verb in our English understanding. So what is the dream? Well, the dream is certain. What characteristic of God Most High are we talking about? Well, it's this ruling characteristic. So if we're going to supply an is kind of idea, we're talking about a predicative use of an adjective. So that's predicative use of adjective. Well, what about the substantive use? What that means is that the adjective is playing the role of a noun. And so in this case, in Daniel 7:18, we see the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom. So the first word is they will receive the kingdom, saints of the Most High. So we see that there's that construct ending on the saints. So this is what I referred to earlier. And it shouldn't be a surprise to us that there would be a construct ending. It's acting as a noun, which we know from context in this case. Now, participles are verbal adjectives. We're not quite ready to talk about participles yet, because since they're verbal adjectives, we want to start talking about the verbal system of biblical Aramaic first before we're ready to bring up participles acting in their nature as adjectives. So we're going to come back to that, but let's remember, starting here, that participles fall into the adjective category. They're related to adjectives because they're verbal adjectives. Next, let's talk about demonstratives. Now, demonstratives, technically from a grammatical standpoint, are pronouns, but they have adjective-like uses in biblical Aramaic, so this is an appropriate time to bring them up. So let's do that. This is the demonstrative pronoun system of biblical Aramaic, and there are some differences we should note with the biblical Hebrew demonstratives. First, biblical Hebrew uses the independent pronoun system to provide far demonstratives. That is not the case. Now, as we've already mentioned when we talked about independent pronouns, some biblical Aramaic independent pronouns function as demonstratives, yes, but there are also dedicated words for that, and we see that on the right with the far demonstratives. The near demonstratives, there's actually a word exactly in common with biblical Hebrew, and that's the ele word, these. There's another these word, as you can see, and both of the these words are common gender, which is to say that they would be associated with nouns that are either masculine or feminine. And that's the same thing with the those word, the far demonstrative for plurals. So that's a few words that a reader of biblical Aramaic needs to learn. And interestingly, for the far singular demonstrative, there's even a common form, even though there's also a specific masculine and a specific feminine form for the demonstrative. Now, how do we? Why is it that I said that these demonstrative pronouns act like adjectives? Well, let's see it. Here's an attributive use. This, the dream I saw. Well, I haven't displayed on the screen the full context of Daniel 4:15, but I saw this dream is how this needs to be read. So this is like I saw the good dream. You know, I mean, that kind of idea. Now, the attributive adjective needs to match in what ways? It's gender, number, and definiteness. Well, there's no aleph at the end of the demonstrative here, is there? Okay, so now we need to bring up Biblical Aramaic does not ever place an aleph on the end of a demonstrative, meaning there's no determined state for a demonstrative. Okay, so this is unlike the Biblical Hebrew custom of putting an article in the front of demonstratives in certain cases. Okay, so we can't depend on the presence of definiteness. We have to use context to figure out which adjective-like use is the one that the author intends for a given use of a demonstrative. So here we have attributive. So this dream is what is supposed to be the reading in Daniel 4:15. But interestingly, the same two words in Daniel 2:36 we understand from sentence syntax, which you don't see here, and various other factors. This is the dream. So we're supplying that to be verb idea in English. Therefore, it's the predicative use. And again, we're not depending on a mismatch in definiteness to know this, because there is no determined state for demonstratives in Biblical Aramaic. So here's attributive on the top, predicative on the bottom. What about substantive use of the demonstratives? Well, here it is. After this, I was seeing in the visions of the night. So this, in this case, is serving a noun-like function in that it's describing some event that's referred to that the reader understands from context, but it's standing in the place of that event, so we can see why a demonstrative is a pronoun. But because these demonstrative uses are so similar to the adjective uses, again, now is the time to talk about them. So demonstratives in Biblical Aramaic, both in near and far systems, have adjective-like uses: attributive, predicative, and substantive. Well, that brings us to the end of our discussion of adjectives. I look forward to the next lesson